Hey everyone, this is Julia with episode number 75 of the Mixology Talk podcast. This podcast is coming out in early June 2016, and around here, the sun is shining. If you haven't already started thinking about your summer cocktail menu, now is definitely the time. Now, we've been playing around with watermelon in our cocktails for a few days, basically because we bought a giant watermelon and so we had to find ways to use it up. And it got me to thinking, for some reason, I think that melons are grossly underrepresented on cocktail menus. And so, obviously, it just seemed like a great opportunity to use that as a topic for today's discussion. So this week, we're going to try to inspire you with some fun ideas for using melons on your cocktail menu. As always, show notes can be found at mixologytalk.com/75 with an outline of the show and links back to everything we mentioned. Let's dig in. So first of all, why melons anyway? I briefly mentioned in the intro that I think that they are underrepresented on cocktail menus, but why is that? I would say, honestly, that they're relatively cheap. I mean, this time of year at our local grocery stores, you're seeing gigantic melons for really very, very reasonable.
Yeah, for a couple of dollars for the entire thing, and there's so much substance inside of them.
Mass.
It's pretty incredible. So from a beverage program standpoint, I mean, there's a lot of bang for your buck on melons.
Yeah, I mean, I'm comparing that to like if you were to make something with strawberries, you have to prep every single individual strawberry. Whereas with a melon, you get a lot of fruit for your prep time, I would think.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah, you can break down a watermelon pretty quickly. And strawberries, to your point, you have to do each one individually. And so you do get a lot of, I guess, utility out of a watermelon.
Bang for your buck. Yeah, exactly. And not only that, I mean, they taste good. I think there's a great flavor there, especially there's some melons that have such a unique flavor, like cantaloupe and watermelon. They're just such a summer fruit to me. I think they belong on a summer cocktail menu.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And I think that one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of melon in cocktail menus is because there's a little bit of a stigma going back to the 80s with melon, like Midori sours.
I could see that.
That kind of stuff. So it's almost like, that's really cute. It's almost pedestrian. It's not very challenging, a lot of people think, I guess.
Well, arguably, it's not very challenging.
And
However,
that's the beauty of it.
That's the beauty of it, exactly. I would say, I think this will probably be the first and last time we mention Midori in this episode. We're going to be talking about actually making your own stuff, making your own ingredients with melon, because quite frankly, it's so easy. Right. And the flavor is fantastic. I don't think there's any reason to resort to something like Midori.
Yeah, and we're also going to be talking about some production tips, what to avoid when working with melon too, just from the experience that I've had working with them. So yeah, we'll kind of cover all those things in the podcast today.
Definitely. And personally, I would say that a good reason to use melons is the fact that nobody else is doing it, especially if you're catering to a consumer crowd. It's got a little bit of that novelty again. I think that, the folks who were in bars in the 80s are probably not in the same bars anymore. They might be in bars,
right?
But they're probably not in the same bars. So you can definitely play with that. And there's a novelty factor as well, which I think is just a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the melons that I've worked with is kind of pretty much all of them, as many as I can get my hands on. The big ones, though, the most common ones that almost everyone can find in their grocery store, watermelon, cantaloupe, and honeydew. I mean, those are just some great melons to work with in cocktails because the flavor really is pronounced.
Honeydew's a little bit of a lighter flavor.
A little bit. Crenshaw melons have a tendency to be pretty light. So if, like, when you open up the melon, you try them, and it has a really great kind of intense flavor, that's something you want to keep, or nice aromatic quality.
I would imagine there are some melons that, I mean, maybe they were just not in season, but I feel like that there's just not a lot of flavor there. I think of I feel like honeydew can be that way. I think Crenshaw can be that way. It's just really tough to work with those in a cocktail setting because you're just liquid.
Right. And that's one of the challenges of working with produce like this is you really don't want to use them off season because the flavors never really develop. So this is one of those things to really pay attention to when you're going to like farmers markets or you're going to the store. Make sure you're buying them in the peak of summer and only utilizing them when they're perfectly in season, because we've all had terrible watermelons where they're just mealy and gross and the flavor it's almost non-existent.
It's so disappointing too. We bought our first melon this year arguably way too early. We were much too optimistic.
Yeah.
And it was bright red and we were so excited and we took a bite and it was so disappointing.
It was absolutely.
It was like water.
Yeah, just be careful. Like I said, just make sure that you're utilizing these ingredients in the height of their season, just like most of the ingredients that we work with. Exactly. And if you wouldn't want to have an entire platter of them, don't use it in your cocktail because the flavor's never going to come through.
I will say that you did something really interesting with that melon I mentioned where the flavor just wasn't quite there yet. Chris had a great idea to sort of kick up the flavor, and that was to add just a tiny, tiny bit of salt to the syrup he was making. And it made all the difference in the world.
Yeah, and watermelon and salt, or any melon and salt, is one of my favorite things during the summer. The salt, it just brings out this amazing quality in the fruit, and it kind of makes it a little bit like savory. That borderline of savory sweet.
Yeah.
So with melon, a lot of things I just add a little touch of salt, and it really changes the flavor profile on there.
Yeah, but I agree with you. I think that definitely try to stay in season with melons, especially. You do have texture issues if you go too late in the season, and you have flavor issues if you're too early. So this is definitely something to consider. When we start to talk a little bit about how to use them, I'll give you some hints for how you might be able to preserve them for later. Yes,
yay.
We'll preview there. But I think the thing about I keep saying lemons.
Same word combination, yeah. Same letter combination. That's funny.
Lemons, melons. There's a bar tongue twister for you. The thing I like about melons is how well they respond to maceration. If you're going to be using melon in your cocktail, I would say, and you're not, you're a beginner behind the bar, still do it. It is so easy. Just go ahead and macerate the melon. And we've talked about this a couple times before, but in 2 sentences, basically, take off the rind, throw all the fruit in a bowl, chopped into cubes, cover it in sugar, stir it up, and come back in 2 hours. You're going to find that the bottom of the bowl is basically swimming in this delicious melon syrup. Strain it out, and you're done. That's it.
Yeah,
that's all you have to do.
Them immediately in cocktails, and it just really preserves that fresh melon quality. I mean, it's whenever you're working with high water content ingredients like this, it's the best way to extract flavor. One of our friends, Diageo, actually recommended this to me a couple of years ago, and it's changed the way I use high water content ingredients like this.
It's so easy. I wouldn't even try anything else, honestly.
Yeah.
I think it's just so easy to do. Now, that being said, of course, you don't need to make a syrup with melon. I kind of skipped over the easiest possible way to use it because I was so excited. And that is juice. Just juice it. Throw those chunks of watermelon in your juicer, or if you don't have a juicer, you can even kind of wing it with a blender and a strainer.
Right. Yeah, and this is, if you want to add flavor to a cocktail, this is the perfect way to do it. You're just going to get a really flavorful liquid. It's not going to be able to hold very well. So if you're going to be using this style of juice in a bar program, I'd say 1 day, maybe 2 at the most, is how long you can hold this stuff, just because of all the reasons we talked about. High sugar content, high water content, and that's just going to breed bacteria and fermentation pretty quickly. So if you're going to be using this kind of juice, make sure it's fresh. Make sure you're keeping it refrigerated. And one of the things that'll happen, especially with watermelon, one of the things you'll see is the material, that fleshy material of watermelon, will start to separate out from the liquid. Mm-hmm. So you're going to get what I call stratification, where the solids is going to separate from the liquids. You'll have to shake it every time. So these are some things to keep in mind if you're going to be utilizing them in a bar program.
So when it separates, have you tried tasting just the clear part?
I think
is that like a new way to clarify?
It could be a new way to clarify. Yeah, I really haven't tried it.
Put that on the list of 1,000 things we need to try.
I know. I imagine the liquid's going to taste almost the same.
Yeah.
I think the only thing that's separating out is actually the material, the flesh of the watermelon.
Mm-hmm. We'll have to try that. That could be really interesting. So yeah, and once again, if you're going to be using melon in the juice form, it is especially important to catch your melon in the peak of the season, because you're going to be using a larger quantity typically in the juice format, and it's, you're not adjusting at all. You could certainly adjust if absolutely necessary if you want to make a consistent batch, but it's definitely more challenging. So
yeah. You mentioned one earlier, and I think this is a really good starting point on how to utilize melon in the summer. The first thing that you mentioned was maceration, starting off with the syrup, and this could be a building block into many different things. I remember that you actually made a really great liqueur about a year ago.
Yeah, we were actually sent a sample of Ball's vodka,
which has an interesting sort of marketing angle.
And it's not Bowls, B-O-L-S.
No, it's B-A-L-L-S.
Okay.
And so I thought it was perfect to use that in a melon ball cocktail just because of the play on words.
Nice.
But of course, starting with vodka, I had to turn that into a melon liqueur. And that's what I did. So I basically just chopped up a cantaloupe, did exactly what I mentioned a moment ago, macerated that with sugar, strained it out, and added spirit. And the result was fantastic. It was not green, which I think usually your melon ball cocktail is green, which makes me wonder if they use a honeydew or green food coloring.
All the colorings.
Mine was, of course, cantaloupe colored, but it was delicious. It was really, really good. And it could not have been easier. It's literally just making a syrup and adding spirit.
Yeah. And this is a really great way to preserve that freshness throughout this many different seasons. So just, onboard a bunch of melon, break it all down, preserve it in alcohol, and then you have a liqueur that you can utilize through the fall and winter and spring of next year, and then you replenish it. There's a bit of it more of a cost, and the idea of drinking melon off season, is
there's always going to be that.
But if you wanted to preserve it, this is a really great way to preserve it throughout the year.
And especially if you've got a short season when the fruit tastes good where you're located, this can be a good way to sort of extend the length of your summer menu.
Right, absolutely. So if we start with that syrup, that macerated syrup, there's another direction that we can go if you don't want to go with the booze route, and that is you can create a shrub. Now, shrubbing is a really old technique.
Is shrubbing a verb?
Shrubbery. Let them have shrubbery.
I like to practice shrubbery at my bar.
But it's a really old technique. Pioneers, I guess, used it. But basically, you're preserving the freshness of ingredients in vinegar. So you're creating essentially what is a sweetened vinegar.
A drinking vinegar.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you can add soda water to it and work them in cocktails.
You're seeing more of them nowadays. I think they're a little bit less obscure nowadays, but it's definitely, I think it's a little bit of a flavor that takes some getting used to.
Right. That vinegar kick
Yeah.
can mess with your mind a little bit because you think it's sweet, but then you taste it and it's sour, but then the sweetness comes in afterwards and there's this weird balancing game.
And especially behind the bar, I think we tend to associate a vinegar flavor with something that's gone bad.
Sour, right, exactly.
And not only that, but I have been some places that use really strong vinegars in their shrubs and they just go crazy with it.
Right.
I think you got to be gentle with people, especially on a consumer-facing cocktail menu. A lot of them will never have had a drinking vinegar before. So what kind of vinegars do you typically use? Not like balsamic, because that'll just kick you in the face.
Well, you can. I mean, there's certain instances where balsamic is a really great idea.
Okay.
You use it more of an accent, and I guess you could use it as a main vinegar as well.
Be careful with it, though. It's super, super strong.
Strawberries and balsamic are ridiculous
That's
together.
true.
They're so good.
That's a match made.
And watermelon and balsamic is actually a really good combo too. But we tend to use a really low intensity vinegar. I think some of the ones that we've used before, champagne vinegar, the raw white industrial vinegar is really intense and it's hard to balance.
And it doesn't bring a good
way.
flavor either.
Right. Apple cider vinegar is a great one.
I want to say we used cane vinegar.
Cane vinegar, it's really hard to find, but if you go to like a Vietnamese or Thai food store, you can find it. I can't remember the name that we use. It's a really
I'm not sure we could
vinegar.
pronounce it anyway.
Right. Not respectively. Well, we have a bad track record of doing that on this podcast anyways.
One of us does.
Yeah, that and terrible accent. So
okay, so you start with a syrup, and how do you make it into a shrub? Like in 2 sentences.
So basically you're going to macerate the fruit and then you're going to let that stand for, 24 hours to really pull out as much flavor as possible. Then you're just going to add vinegar to that while the fruit is still in the bowl. So if you do 8 cups of sugar, add 8 cups of vinegar. So that's kind of the starting point.
And then tweak from there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you need to add more, if you need to add a different vinegar to increase a little bit of that vinegar profile or, add a little bit of water to dilute it down, that's a good starting point.
Play with it. Yeah. So you may not want to sort of toss it in your whole batch. You may want to pull out some smaller
you can
bits.
Split it in half. If you're doing a big master
Exactly.
recipe, you can do half syrup and then pull out half and make a shrub, or pull out a third, make a liqueur, make a shrub, and make a syrup out of it.
Go crazy.
You can get pretty nuts on that.
I love it. No, that's great. And I think, like I said, that's a great way to, again, make sure that those flavors last through the season or even beyond. I would say shrubs, I kind of feel like shrubs feel like a fall. They can go into fall. They're less weird to me. I think perhaps because vinegar starts to be a little bit of a winter flavor.
And this is one of the things that always kind of strikes me as interesting is when you have a program like that that's very seasonally driven, a lot of the produce and a lot of the techniques for producing these things take longer than the actual season is. So
Dope.
So sometimes you're just like, oh man, I just did an infusion that took me 3 months and now the season's gone and I have to wait a year to make it.
Dang it.
So
Strawberry infusion for your Christmas cocktail menu.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that I like to do when putting together a melon cocktail is to play with the garnish. I think it's a great sort of, there's so much you can do with it.
You can get really creative with
Yeah,
them.
like a strawberry, you don't have a lot to play with. But with melon, first of all, it's so inexpensive. And secondly, it's so, there's so much you can do. I mean, of course, there's a quintessential melon ball. Gotta do that, of course, especially if you're doing a melon ball cocktail. Or you can cut it into cube and throw that on the side of the glass or put it on your cocktail pick. You can obviously do a wedge. This is especially great with watermelon just because you've got the color, especially if your watermelon looks nice. Then that's a great option. And then actually, Chris had an idea that I've never tried before, which sounds delicious.
It's really good. It's pickled watermelon rind. This is
it's the white part, right?
The white pithy part of the watermelon. You actually pickle it, and it is fantastic. It's kind of fresh and vibrant, and we've all had that watermelon rind flavor. When you are a little too excited about watermelon, you go a little too deep on it. So it preserves that freshness, and it could be a really great garnish for a cocktail, so especially with a shrub with the pickled watermelon rind, because you already have that vinegar component. Then you add a little bit of a different kind of a herbal element into the pickling liquid with all the salt and everything like that. It is fantastic.
So do you cut off the green part as well? You cut off the skin and you cut out the fruit and you're left with just the white part then you pickle that.
And if you wanted to, you could leave a ribbon of melon on there as well. So you have that of 2-color combination. And my understanding is this is a really good thing to add during barbecues as well, because you get that sweet, you get a little bit of that vinegar inside of the barbecue sauce, a little bit of the sweetness, and this kind of complements that really well also. This is where I first found it. When we were doing a menu, one of the chefs created a pickled watermelon rind to go with barbecue pork ribs.
Oh, wow.
And the combination together was fantastic. And I was like, I love the flavor of this. I'm using watermelons already. And then he showed me the pickling process of it. So then I utilized it as a garnish, and it was really, really amazing.
That sounds really good. Yeah, I have not tried that yet, but I have a suspicion we'll be trying it soon.
I have a feeling we will.
And then, of course, I think we've kind of covered the easier things that you can do.
I do have one other recommendation, and this will work for a little bit more of the firmer melons that we're talking about. And imagine cooking or cutting them almost flat and then using cookie cutters to create some fun shapes.
That's a great idea.
With watermelon, you're not going to be able to do it just because there's so much air in there that the minute you cookie cut it and put a skewer through it, the whole thing's just going to fall apart.
You could probably do it with like cantaloupe, though.
I mean, cantaloupe, honeydew, a lot of these other have a much kind of denser texture to them. You could definitely do that as well.
That's a great idea. I definitely didn't even think of that. So there are a couple more advanced things that you can do behind the bar. I don't know if we've tried all of these.
Yeah, I don't think there's one or two that I haven't tried, but there's a couple that I'm really excited about.
Not surprisingly.
Yeah.
So what about compressed melon? Is this one you've tried or just you want to try?
I have tried this, and it's amazing. So when I was working in a fine dining restaurant, and we had what we call a sous vide machine, basically a water-controlled bath. To add anything to a water-controlled bath, you have to have it in a vacuum-sealed bag. So the vacuum sealer that we had, you could adjust the pressure of, and then you put whatever you want inside the little plastic bags, and it vacuum seals it, and it compresses it inside of the bag. So one of the things that you can do with that is add liquids to it, so into the bag, and do like really quick flash pickling. So imagine like a pickling solution and a bunch of cucumbers. You put them in there, vacuum seal it, and within a couple of minutes you have pickles. Yeah, and it preserves the freshness of the cucumber. It's a really cool process. So I was experimenting it with melon, particularly watermelon, because of what we talked about earlier. It's such a loose texture that you can't really do a lot with it. So I added melon into a compression bag, compressed it, let it sit for about 20 minutes, and what I pulled out essentially looked exactly like really beautiful ahi tuna. All the air was compressed out of the watermelon. You're left with this really cool firm texture, and when you have it, your mind thinks ahi tuna because it cuts like tuna as well.
Wow.
But then you taste it and you're like, that's watermelon, but it's really firm. This is weird.
That would be an incredible garnish.
Yeah, it was really cool. And actually I used them in the cocktail. I shook them in the cocktail, and they're so compressed that they didn't break apart like a normal watermelon would.
Oh, wow.
So you had these kind of bigger chunks of watermelon that got slightly broken apart inside this cocktail. And then when you would sip them through the straw, you'd like get this weird effect. It was really cool.
That is pretty crazy.
Yeah. So the other thing, like I mentioned, you could add water and liquid to it. And so I added a syrup in there, a flavored syrup, and orange bitters, and it was absolutely fantastic.
Oh, so you kind of infused the watermelon during the process.
Exactly. So we're pushing out a lot of the water from the watermelon, and we're introducing a lot of that sweetness and that aromatic quality of the orange bitters in there. It was like on its own is fantastic, but then when you add it to a cocktail that features all those flavors, it just really enhances everything.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That sounds amazing. So another one, I'm cheating a little bit because this is not actually a melon item so much as something that thou shalt try with melon, and that is meat salt.
Oh, it was so good.
I'm sure we've mentioned this so many times on this podcast because it's so good. But you made, I want to say, was it cantaloupe or honeydew? I don't remember.
It's a form of cantaloupe.
Okay.
It's a variety of cantaloupe.
And you made a tequila cocktail with it and then rimmed the glass with a prosciutto salt.
Yeah, so one of those classic combinations during the summer is prosciutto and melon. It's just the saltiness from the prosciutto, the melon, and the savoriness. It just goes really, really well together. So I kind of did a cocktail that was a play on that. And then the meat salt that I created was a prosciutto and rosemary salt. And then that was my accent, the rim on there. And it's a bit strange.
It was so good.
But the flavors were fantastic. When I was doing the event, it was for probably about 400 or 500 people. I had to, every time I serve one, like, that's meat.
Not vegetarian friendly.
This is not a vegetarian.
This is not a vegan cocktail.
Chunks of dried prosciutto on the edge here. It was
good.
And we still use that salt.
You made so much of it. I will tell you, if you make prosciutto salt, we'll put a link in the show notes on I think somewhere we have the recipe. If you make it, make a bunch because it makes the best fried eggs.
Oh, the eggs are so good.
It's
prosciutto
so good.
Salt on the top of fried egg. Oh,
yeah.
Man.
Changes your life.
It's a game changer. It really is. And it's always something you're like, I wonder if it would be better if I put prosciutto salt. Yes.
It's usually, there have been one or two things that didn't work, although I can't remember them off the top of my head. Most things work.
Yeah, we added them to pork chops.
Oh yeah.
They're so good.
That was so meta.
I know. Pork on pork action. That almost sounds terrible.
We'll let that go.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll let that go. So back to things you can do with melons. This sounds terrible too. This is one I don't think we have tried, but I've heard of it. And I would love to hear from anybody out there who's successfully used this technique. And that is carbonating melon. Now, I've heard of this in the context of watermelon, again, because of the qualities we've talked about earlier. Lots of water, lots of flavor, and the sort of texture of the melon seems to be amenable to this sort of thing. I've heard of folks actually carbonating the melon itself.
Yeah.
Which sounds awesome.
Yeah, and I've never heard of this technique up to this point, but I imagine if I were to go through this process, I think what I would try is to get one of those whipped cream containers, the Izzy's, load it, about halfway up with melon, put a fun little liquid in there, like I mentioned, like a syrup, some bitters or something else. And then you just add a couple of CO2 cartridges to it, and it should have a compressed watermelon flavor or a carbonated melon flavor to it, which should be really, really good. So that's how I would try and move from there. So maybe we'll try that soon.
Yes, yes. And again, if anybody else out there, I'm sure somebody has tried this successfully. I would absolutely love to hear how you did it. Let us know in the show notes, mixologytalk.com/75.
Perfect.
So now a couple of don'ts. We've done the do's. Here are the don'ts. And these are just a couple things that Chris has found over the years do not work well with melon.
Yeah. And there is some caveats. I mean, the resulting flavor will be better, will be okay, but properly or to best get the flavor out of them, I would avoid a little bit of these techniques. The first one is infusion. Now, I know a lot of people do infusions, and like I said, it's great, but there's a couple things to consider when you're doing this. First of all, the water content. When you have a high water content item like this, what's going to happen is it's going to drop the alcohol content of whatever the resulting liquor is, or the infused liquor is going to be. The other problem is you're not going to get a ton of extraction out of it. So the flavor of it is not going to be as intense as you would hope. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to add sugar to it to boost up some of the flavor. At that point, you could have just made a liqueur.
Right.
And have a much more intense flavor and a beautiful color to it as well.
And like we said, the maceration process takes an hour, maybe.
Right.
It's going to be so much faster than an infusion anyhow.
Right, exactly. So you can infuse. There's nothing wrong with that. And you'll get a good liquid out of it. But the best that I've found, and this is just my own personal opinion, is the other way of actually macerating the fruit. It just gives such a better pull a flavor out.
Right, exactly. And speaking of syrups, the other don't is we're really going to recommend against using heat when making syrups with melon. When making syrups in general, there's kind of a couple different ways that are very, very common. Maceration is one of them. And the other is to kind of like to simmer your fruit in a simple syrup over the stove. And that will extract the flavor. Not recommended here.
Right. As always, there's always instances where it will make sense.
An experiment, we're not going to say no, but...
Right.
Yeah.
But for this one, to your point, the minute you start to heat these syrups up, you're going to start to break down some of those flavors. So, for example, when you do this to strawberries, you're going to get a cooked strawberry flavor instead of a fresh. So if that's the angle you're going for, then by
watermelon.
all means... Right, exactly. Then by all means, go for that. But, if you want to preserve that really fresh component to it, all those little nuances of the aroma that you're really hoping to capture, keeping the temperature as low as possible is really going to be able to pull that flavor out.
And I think one other thing, it's just so easy. It's so easy to do the maceration approach. It works so well in this case. It's kind of like, why bother complicating it?
Right, exactly. Absolutely.
So that's my lazy approach. So now I thought we would leave you with a little bit of inspiration. Over the years, we've done quite a bit with melons in various cocktails, and I thought that maybe we'd show you a little show and tell.
Yeah. So the first one that we utilize is actually yours with a homemade melon liqueur.
Yeah, the melon ball cocktail. That's such an easy one. I would say if you're looking at playing with melons in a cocktail setting, start here. It is so easy, and I think it comes out really, really tasty. The key on this one is to watch your sugar. I think if you go into any bar down the street and order a melon ball cocktail, you're in danger of getting something that's just an absolute sugar bomb. And so the nice thing about making your own is you can make it to taste, and you can really highlight that melon flavor without getting too crazy on the sugar. So I think this is a great place to start, but do watch your sugar content.
Yeah, and then this next couple examples is really a good example of how to utilize many different things starting off with a syrup. So the first one we did was a salted watermelon cooler. So we'll put a link into that in the show notes here. But I made this one for you about a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, about that.
And it's just a great way to incorporate flavor. I think there was some muddled cucumber in there and topped off with some ginger beer or soda water. I can't remember what it was. But
it was ginger beer, and it was really good.
Yeah, and it has a really cool little color to it. It's not like bright pink like you would imagine, but it's got a beautiful color to it. But it was really great. Great
flavor, yeah. I mean, it was basically just watermelon syrup with a little bit of salt added, like we mentioned earlier, lime juice and ginger beer, and it just came together beautifully. It was really, really simple. Again, this is a non-alcoholic one, so this is actually something really great to consider for like a family barbecue or something. We're actually going to a family barbecue later today, and I think we're bringing this.
Yeah, we're gonna bring a giant batch of this, and it'll be hopefully received very well.
Yes, exactly. And then the next one that I would love to highlight was a Mezcal cocktail that Chris made called Smoky Summer Nights. And I love the name on this one. But the key here really was the use of Mezcal and how it worked really nicely with the same salted watermelon syrup.
So yeah, we use the same exact syrup that we used in the non-alcoholic one. And this really kind of demonstrates, once you make this really beautiful syrup, you can utilize it in a couple different components in your beverage menu. But this one had that smoky kind of quality from the mezcal. So you're thinking like summer barbecues and, get all these great flavors going on. A little bit of cucumber muddled in there, some lime juice, Luxardo maraschino, and some orange bitters just kind of add some aromatic quality to it as well.
But the garnish on this one was awesome.
Yeah, and this one was a piece of cucumber. I made a coin of cucumber, and I wrapped a little tiny cube of watermelon together. So you kind of get this green, white, and red, and it just
which kind of looked like a watermelon. It was great.
I put a little bit of salt across both of them.
Oh, of course you
did. The cucumber and the watermelon. And if you haven't had cucumber and salt, it's fantastic as well.
Exactly. So that one came together nicely. And now the last one is actually not coming out until the day after this podcast goes up.
Right, and it is probably my favorite cocktail of this whole process. So I took that same syrup and I made a shrub out of it. So I added some vinegar to it. So you already had the salty component inside of the watermelon syrup. And so I was like, okay, well, I know that salt and Campari has some fun things happening with it. If you ever do a salt solution, try Campari side by side with a little bit of salt solution next to it, or inside of one and then the raw ingredient in the other. And what you'll notice is that the salt kind of mellows out some of the bitterness and allows some of the fruity qualities of Campari to shine through. So it's like, okay, cool. I already got my salt in the shrub. So I added Campari, gin, some agave nectar in there, and it turned out absolutely fantastic.
It was so good.
It was gone in like a minute and a half.
Definitely
it was so
surprised
tasty.
me. No, I will say I was surprised by this one because I'm not going to lie. Watermelon shrub with Campari sounds weird.
Yeah.
I'm going to own that.
This one was a bit of a leap of faith on my part. I'm like, I don't know, but I'm going to try it.
You got the color. That's about it.
Yeah. And I think I had a little bit of soda water to that as well, but it's coming out in the next couple of days. So.
Yeah, it'll be out the day after this podcast comes out.
So yeah, definitely check all those out.
So hopefully this episode has given you a bit of inspiration for ways you can use this underappreciated summer fruit in your home bar or on your menu. At the very least, it has made me thirsty. So I would love to hear more ideas for using melons and how you've used them in the past. If you've done the carbonated melon trick, I would love to hear from you. And definitely, I'm sure that there are other ideas out there that we have missed. So let us know in the comments over at mixologytalk.com/75. And of course, you can check out all the links that we mentioned there as well. Enjoy those melon cocktails, everyone. Cheers! Never miss an episode by subscribing in iTunes or YouTube. And as always, check out the show notes by clicking on the right.